Welcome to EconRoots, a podcast on the history of economic thought brought to you by CEPOS and your host, Stefan Sløk-Madsen. In today's talk, recorded at the APEE Conference 2022 in Las Vegas, we are honored to be joined by Michael C. Munger, Professor of Political Science and Director of the PPE Certificate Program at Duke University. Professor Munger has made tremendous research contributions within the functioning of markets, regulation, and government institutions. He has taught at Dartmouth College, University of Texas, and University of North Carolina, as well as working as a staff economist at the Federal Trade Commission during the Reagan Administration. He is a past president of the Public Choice Society. He was North American editor of the journal Public Choice for 5 years and is now a co-editor of the Independent Review. Dr. Munger has had a profound influence on many young economists today. However, today we're here to talk about the PhD supervisor and Nobel Prize recipient Douglas C. North and the importance of institutions and how they change.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Mike. You have been a huge influence on me and my academic life, so it's a great honor to have you as a guest here today on EconRoots. But we're not going to talk about you, at least not that much.
I hope not.
We are going to talk about one of the laureates, Douglas North, because you recently did a paper on him, and I know you talked about the importance of institutions before and so on. So let's get the ball rolling here. Why was he important, and why is he important?
For me personally, he was important because he was one of my dissertation advisors. So he was a big influence on the way that I thought about institutions. I actually, for the first decade or so after I finished graduate school, had a great antipathy towards his approach. In fact, I published a paper in the Journal of Law and Economics called The Rationality of Ideology. I thought North's view of ideology was just wrong. In 1994, I published a paper, a book about ideology and the theory of political choice, which was an extension of the Downesian notion of ideology. And North's view of ideology was that it was not rational, that it was precisely a set of beliefs that we have that condition our participation in markets, in politics. So I think the reason that he was important in the 1980s in particular was that he had a view of economic history which took time seriously. Mm-hmm. Now, that sounds ridiculous, but history often is a series of snapshots where you try to detail as accurately as possible using archives, who was there, who said what just exactly what happened, without any sort of theory. North was very interested in theory about what happens over time, and I didn't realize until much later that that's one of the hallmarks of the Austrian school of economics, taking time seriously in the way that we think about durables and the way that we think about planning and the formation of expectation. So in a way, although North himself did not consider himself a member of the Austrian school, his approach was very congenial with the kind of Austrian approach to economics. So after 1990 or so, I started to come around and realized that North's view was correct. And one of the things that has really interested me about one of the questions North would ask in economic seminars was, where do preferences come from? And economists never ask that question. We are supposed to take preferences as being fixed and exogenous. It's an interesting question, but that's for sociologists and psychologists. And so on. And of course, they come from somewhere, and that's important. But what we do is we take preferences as given, and then we use the comparative statics approach to analyze the changes in behavior that result from differences in prices, differences in income, maybe in the grander scheme in economic history, changes in meteorological conditions, changes in the value of resources, but it's always a comparative statics approach. But the change in preferences over time, and by preferences really, and North and I, we always argued about this, and I eventually realized he was right, and so did he. I was right all along. An ideology is a set of shared preferences that are mediated by institutions. So if I have a particular set of views, that's not an ideology. It has to be shared, and it has to be mediated by some sort of institutional setting. So North was very interested in ideology, and I think his view of ideology has actually won out. It has had a big influence on more modern economics, both the history and in development economics. We use a different name sometimes for ideology, though, and there's kind of a contest over this. We call it culture.
Oh, yeah.
So,
yes. Yeah.
Culture is a set of shared perceptions of norms or the correct way to act about social conventions, and different countries have very different ones. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that's interesting, and North started to work on this towards the end of his life, is human beings are actually evolutionarily designed, and I'm making air quotes because evolution doesn't really design, but it's as if we were literally designed to be ideological enforcement machines. Because if I see the violation of a social norm, I might, if I were Homo economicus, I would say, that person has violated the rules. But I know that it would be providing a public good for me to enforce this norm. It's irrational to provide norm enforcement. I'm just going to let them get away with it. No, that's not what happens. What happens is my body is suffused with a cocktail of chemicals that causes me to become angry. And against my own volition, I will shout at that person and say, no, you're breaking the rules. I lived in Germany in 2009, and this happened to me almost every day. I almost always violated unknowingly some norm. And when the German person found out I was an idiot American, it was fine. Okay, we expect nothing.
We expect
Americans.
nothing more.
But the Germany is a very norm-based society. Now, they have formal rules also. But if you violate a norm in Germany, you will be told about it by an angry person. And so we're actually literally designed biologically to provide the public good of norm enforcement at extremely low cost.
Yeah.
And North's insight was that means that we're much better at cooperating than the prisoner's dilemma kind of approach to social interaction would indicate. Homo economicus is a sociopath. Fortunately, he doesn't exist.
Yeah, it's a bit of a straw man, right?
Yes.
Yeah. But that approach to North sort of aligns very much with Werner Smith, right? The idea of ecological rules and these kind of things and constructive rules. But I must challenge you a little bit, because I remember you once told a story, I think it was on Econ Talk, about you lining up for a cinema in New York, and a girl cheated the line, and there was no real gain to her because the seatings were fixed. Correct me if I don't remember the story correctly. But when you try to correct her, she goes around and threaten you with, she threatened you with saying that you grabbed her or whatever, right? So you violating a norm. How would North handle that? Like, what's the right approach to that situation then?
Any evolutionarily stable system must be able to fend off mutants.
Yeah, all right, yes.
And so a mutant who doesn't care about other people's feelings about them is going to be impervious. And that means that a society that's actually based on sanctions that take the form of shame and guilt will be able to survive and, in fact, thrive. And so an interesting question is, if you have a story about culture that depends on the setting in which human beings originated. So 100,000 years ago, we live in small groups. And if I don't have the trust of other people, if I don't share things, you're going to put me outside the wall. And there's big animals out there. I won't live long on my own.
No.
So it's almost like a hive of bees, and individual bees cannot survive. That's not true of modern society. Modern society, we can live much more like individuals.
Yeah.
And so these biological responses that make us do norm enforcement are actually atavisms. Mm-hmm. So Friedrich Hayek talked about the problem of atavism. He often thought that these atavisms were moral intuitions that once had a value but maybe no longer do. So if I see price gouging, it makes me unhappy. If I see high prices in response to a shortage, it makes me unhappy. But in fact, that's how markets work. It's a signal to try to get more. And so the supply elasticity suggests that there's going to be a solution to this. But people don't know that because their moral intuition is that price going up is wrong. So I wouldn't say that it's fully an atavism, but there's a conflict where individuals who are Homo economicus are more likely to be able to survive. And in my example, it wasn't that the woman cutting in line got no benefit. She probably saved an hour. The point of the example was she cost me nothing.
Oh, point. All right, good point. Yeah.
Yet I was still angry.
Yes. Yeah.
And then so that was point one.
Yeah.
So she saved an hour. She stole an hour from the people in line collectively.
Yeah.
Me as an individual, it was maybe 30 seconds. That's how long I now had to wait in a longer line, one person longer.
Yeah.
But the interesting part was that I became angry and challenged her and said, you can't do that. And she said, if you say another word, I'm going to tell the police you assaulted me. And I was so undone that I couldn't sleep that night. So the story has 2 points, and you really raised them both, but let me emphasize this. One is that the system, to the extent that it becomes impersonal, can be invaded by mutants to an extent that wasn't true. The second is we do still have this perhaps atavistic response. I was upset out of all proportion to the damage that was done to me. That was silly.
Yeah.
There really was no reason for me to be so upset.
You should just shook it off, probably.
Yes.
Yeah, that would be right.
Well, and a rational person would have.
Yeah.
Human beings are not rational, and it is rational for us to be not rational. We are better off not being rational. We are better off being robbed of our own volition and doing the collectively optimal thing, even though a selfish individual would not do that. So that North always would make the claim that it's surprising that market systems work as well as they do impersonal. His definition of North's definition of markets was a system for reducing a set of institutions for reducing the transactions cost of impersonal exchange. So if I go to the same butcher in Copenhagen every week and I always buy the same thing, he gives me a little bit extra, or it's an extra nice cut of meat. Yeah. That's not really impersonal. That's repeat business.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But if I go into a Walmart and I'll never see that person again, and I buy something and I give them a plastic card and they accept it as payment, all the personal parts of that are taken out. So even though human beings are built to cooperate in particular ways, markets, in order to operate at a scale sufficient to elaborate division of labor, require impersonal exchange. And that conflict motivates an awful lot of the social change in institutions that we see over time. So it took me a long time to understand that was North's story.
I think I'm having a revelation as well here. So that explanation would be why North would not say, I believe in markets is an ideology, right? Because often that would be portrayed as an ideology.
Yes.
But if you have that understanding, it's not an ideology.
It could be an ideology in the sense that if you do not understand that argument for markets, and you're for markets just because it's the apotheosis of personal liberty.
Yeah.
So it could be an implication of an ideology. But the argument for markets is that there is no other system for elaborating division of labor that allows us to achieve such widely shared increases in wealth.
Yeah.
It's a Pareto improvement, and that's not an ideology. However, there are many ideologues who favor markets for different reasons.
Good point. I'm just going to break 2 seconds to make sure everything's recorded. This is a really good conversation, by the way. So,
well, I obviously enjoy talking about it. So
I can see that. Yeah, perfect. Everything's good. And I trust that. All right. So. Right now, and this is a little bit controversial, so we'll cut it out if you don't want to talk about it, but so right now, we see a lot of institutional change driven by wokeism, identity politics, maybe also Me Too. What do you think North would think about this now? Because as a classical liberal, I often find myself challenged by this. I welcome some of these changes, I do, but I also see there's a lot of bloodshed, or whatever you would call it. What do you think?
Doug North's history was complicated, and he would often laugh at himself about this because it seemed like his views were incoherent. So he was pro-market in the sense that we've talked about, that markets are the only effective system for elaborating division of labor.
Yeah.
But he thought there were a lot of problems with markets also. And some of that I think he brought with him from his Marxist socialist past. Mm-hmm. So he had gone to Berkeley as an undergraduate. He thought of going several places for graduate school. He went to Berkeley to get a PhD in economics, and then he went to the University of Washington, and he was a Marxist historian.
Yeah.
And so his view of the progress of history was mostly driven by political conflict that had its base in differences in class. And he took literally that idea of class about the differences in the relation of the ownership, the means of production. And so his view of ideologies in the slave South, his view of the change in the development of the American Republic, he often saw it in terms of the difficulty of labor or other groups that had problems overcoming collective action problems.
Yeah.
And for that reason, he thought that institutions could sometimes be a way of overcoming those collective action problems. But they also could be a means of suppressing the rising of oppressed groups. So one of North's interesting ideas about institutions was he would define institutions as always having two roles. One is that institutions are the humanly devised rules of the game that shape and direct human behavior. And the other one is that institutions are a means of identifying and preserving the existing distribution of wealth and power.
Okay.
So property rights actually do both of those things. And so one of the examples that he would use, remember the time that I knew North was from 84 to 2005, he would often use the former Soviet Union as an example. So there's a sort of lawless period after about 92 or 93 in the Soviet Union where all of the state-owned enterprises were sold off, which means they were stolen by oligarchs.
Yeah.
And then who were the biggest proponents of property rights? The sons and daughters of the oligarchs. Yeah. We stole this fair and square. It's ours now.
So from homesteading.
So the advocacy for property rights might be motivated by an ideologically pure, authentic view that this is the right thing to do. But the advocacy for property rights could very well be trying to annex the coercive power of the state. Because they have tanks and attack helicopters.
Yeah.
They can protect me against having my stolen property taken back by the righteous rage of the masses. And so both of those things are true. And so that's why it seems complicated. So the answer to your question about wokeism is I think he would be very sympathetic to a sort of delayed reaction to patriarchy and racism. Mm-hmm. And so for people like me to say now, oh, wokeism is oppressing me, it would be a lot more plausible if 20 years ago I had said, you know, it's wrong that this room of administrators is composed entirely of white men. Since I didn't protest then, it's a little implausible that I would protest now.
Oh, that's a good point. That's good. And that's his whole idea about the time as we start the conversation.
Yeah, and the sort of consistency about your notion of institutions.
Yeah.
Because all of us are going to invoke self-serving reasons that plausibly sound like the first institutional category. That is, we have an authentic belief. But usually it also has at least some elements of protecting the existing distribution of wealth and power.
Yeah.
So when someone like me says wokeism is bad, I'm just trying to hold on to my power.
Oh, good point. Good point. So going back to, you said something really interesting about his background as a Marxian.
And he also was in the Merchant Marine. So he was a conscientious objector to World War II.
Yeah.
He was drafted in World War II, but he refused to serve.
Oh.
Because he was a conscientious objector. He had religious objections.
Yeah.
And so he was assigned to the Merchant Marine.
Oh.
And sailed as a just Merchant Marine sailor. And so his idea of
was also dangerous, by the way.
It was very dangerous.
Yeah.
And he, but they didn't have guns. And so that was the being subjected to danger. He wasn't a coward. No. He just didn't want to participate in fighting. Yeah. And so I think that affected his view of labor. Because if you're a sailor, you know, the hierarchy in the Merchant Marine is maybe even more than in the Navy.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. So my question was going along the lines of, we see many of the Nobel laureates actually starting out as having fairly left-wing views. Buchanan had it, Samuelson had it, and so on. Some stay more or less, but many change. Many become more liberal or center-right or whatever you want to call it. What can we learn as intellectuals from North's approach to keeping an open mind? Is there something to learn there? Because I think he did that, right? He had an open mind going through life. It seems like that's part of his legacy.
If you read his later works, and you see his admiration for Hayek, you see his description of the evolutionary process that markets cause, partly driven by the sort of dialectic of profits and loss, and you get innovation and growth. His big concern was that the simple way to put it is the world getting better?
Oh, yeah. Yes, good point.
And the world is getting better when it comes to markets.
Yeah.
He thought that there were not sufficient feedback loops, or we didn't have enough information to identify the causal relation between institutions and outcomes to be able to say institutions are bad. So the question that he would often ask, and he put it in the form of a puzzle. Why is it that some nations prosper and grow, and other apparently similar nations, or even nations that are situated better in terms of natural resources, not only fail to grow, but wither and bump along at the bottom of their possible growth path. And his answer was, first, we're really bad at understanding institutions. Markets give us profits and loss. For all their problems, they give us profits and loss. The problem with institutions is we're not very good at understanding them. Yeah. But second, he was really interested in a concept called lock-in. And so lock-in, and I've actually, this is one of the things I've written a fair amount recently. An example might be corruption. We all recognize that corruption prevents developing nations from growing. India has a terrible problem with corruption. Oh, yeah. So in order for me to get a telephone, from the state telephone company, although now they have cell phones, but in order to get any sort of service from the state companies, they'll schedule it 6 months out. It's hard to get. The service is bad. But I say, look, maybe there's a fee that I haven't paid. If I would give you 1 million rupees, in that case, we can be there tomorrow. Well, that's actually the Coase theorem at work.
It is, yeah.
Because what that says is resources will be targeted at their higher valued use. I have a good idea. I can make money. I can actually get the resources that I want, but it only happens through corruption. And so Gordon Tullock observed that maybe sometimes corruption can work out rather well. North's observation took it to the next level. All right, but what is the consequence of having a society in which the jobs, the salaries for many public positions, those salaries are negative? Yeah. So the inspector has to pay his boss for the right to collect all this bakshish. So then I come out and I say, I'm from the West. And you know what? Corruption's really bad. It's holding back the development of your nation. So we're going to get rid of corruption. And the inspector says, hell no, I bought this job. It was really expensive. It is now a money-producing asset. So they will oppose this with every fiber of their being because there's an enormous amount of money at stake in keeping the corrupt system. So ideally, you'd want to contract around this. And so you say, if we go to a market system, there will be such a big increase in money, we'll be able to compensate you. But it's not a credible commitment. First, it's illegal, so I can't compensate you for being corrupt. But second, once we get rid of corruption and then we say, okay, now it's time for me to get my money, the new democratic government says, well, I don't think so. We've changed our mind. So there's no way of contracting around that time problem again. And so lock-in means that there's nothing irrational about a country with suboptimal institutions. Everybody knows they have suboptimal institutions. You cannot compensate the existing rent holders with a present value of a stream of income that would keep them at the same level. So since they have power and they control the military, they will veto any move. And it's because they themselves will not be better off under the new system. Economists always talk about Pareto optimality as if it were possible to make compensations, but it's not. So my invocation of the Coase theorem is because transactions costs are so high. If transactions costs are high, but resources still go towards their higher valued use because I can engage in corrupt practices, the country is locked in. And so one of the mysteries of development economics is, why do these countries stay corrupt? It's not a mystery at all.
You are listening to EconRoots, your podcast on the history of economic thought. Thank you for joining the conversation.
Why is this not more widely known?
I write about it all the time. So if you're asking why people don't read my articles, gosh, that hurts. That's hard.
Sorry, Mike.
No, it's well deserved. But I believe actually a fair number of development economists, William Easterly, are starting to realize this.
All right.
Well, he realized it a long time ago. I'm starting to realize that he's realized this. Yeah. But there is a development management industry.
Oh, yeah.
At the UN, AID, a lot of very large, they're nonprofit companies, but there's a bunch of people getting paid a lot of money. And so Stafford Beer's famous observation was every system is very carefully designed to produce the results of the current system.
Oh, yeah.
It's very difficult to break out of that. So there's a lot of payments that go to these countries. William Easterly said too, and I had not thought of this, but it's a brilliant insight. Most foreign aid that's done at the national level is a transfer from the middle class of developed nations to the upper classes of developing nations. So it goes from our middle class to wealthy people in developing nations. And they promise that they will have the policies that we want, that the West wants. But that means that they're under no pressure to develop institutions that would be more democratic and responsive, because they have enough money they can pay it off.
Yeah, of course.
Some people have compared this to the resource curse. So if you have a lot of oil, like Venezuela or Russia,
or Norway,
you can maintain these bad institutions because you can pay it off.
Yeah.
Well, aid can take the same form. You have this source of money that's not dependent on you serving people, and you can pay off your cronies and pay off the military and survive indefinitely. And constantly you can hire young MBAs who will say, oh no, we promise this new development work is going to be great.
That's actually a really interesting argument. And we have to move on now, but I just want to hear your thoughts on this, because I've recently done a lot of work on the history of Danish capitalism in the 20th century, and we are a resource poor nation, but we are really good at trade, and that creates a surplus that actually maintains this argument that would actually be able to maintain the redistribution, right? Because without that, there is no redistribution, and we will need to meet more reforms. So it's sort of like, so it doesn't even have to be resources, right? It can just be that if you actually have good institutions that generate, for instance, trade, that can actually also get you to another type of lock-in. Would you agree with that?
Well, it's a really different kind of lock-in, and that is a very interesting question. You talked about it for a long time, but I actually have a little article about how capitalism saved Sweden.
Oh,
so the 1990, 1991, Sweden wanted to have a welfare state, but they were dying because they had so many state-owned enterprises.
Yeah.
They made a very rational decision. If we want to have a generous welfare state, we have to be able to generate a surplus. The only system that does that is capitalism.
Yeah.
And so as a result, capitalism became robustly Sweden became robustly capitalist, and so did Denmark. Not long ago, the Danish prime minister actually admonished Bernie Sanders. We're not socialists. Exactly. Stop saying that.
Stop saying that.
Exactly. If you want to say we have a welfare state, fine. But it's financed by a capitalist surplus. Oh, yeah. And we rely on that. And nobody, I think, in the Scandinavian countries is confused about that. So they scratch their heads when they hear American leftists say, we should be socialists, like Sweden and Denmark.
It's a really funny conundrum. Like, actually, on the Economic Freedom Index, I think Denmark is higher than the US now, right? Like,
and Sweden, on many dimensions, is higher than the US. Sweden has more billionaires per capita than the United States. Wow. So in terms of wealth inequality, Sweden has a lot of inequality. Yeah. They just have income equality.
Yeah. Cool. So at the Public Choice Conference a month ago, which I didn't get to go to because of COVID, but you had a paper there, and it's a bit of a long title, so we'll get it right now. Shared Beliefs: the basic space and the constrained nature of rationality in judging institutions. Was that right?
That's the correct title.
That is the correct title.
It's a terrible title. Hearing it, no, it's not right. I want to change the title.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about what it's all about?
Well, it was actually a kind of mea culpa, where the ideology book that I already talked about, we extended the Downesian model, and let me see if I can put this simply. The Downesian model of political science, after Anthony Downs, said that voters have preferences in an n-dimensional space, but then they use ideology as a means of economizing on the cost of gathering information. So I'm a leftist or a rightist, depending on whether that, on average, provides me a candidate who will be closer to my position in a very large dimensional space. So there's a lot of rationality going on there. First, voters know their preferences in the large space. I know what I want on every dimension of public activity. But then I'm rational in the sense that it takes way too much work to figure out what candidates are actually going to do. And so I use a heuristic called ideology, and left-right then is just a heuristic. Yeah. That was the Downesian model. So we wrote that book to try to, and North, he blurbed the book for me, but he told me, this is way too Downesian. This is terrible. You can't really believe this. People don't think like this. And so for a long time, I argued with him. Then I stopped arguing. Then I just realized he was right. So the North's paper in Kyklos with another of my professors, Arthur Denzoff, was the famous paper on mental models. Yeah. And it's very widely cited. It's the most widely cited paper ever published in Kyklos. It claims that people start out with sort of core values and mental models of the way the world worked that operate at a very high level of very high dimension. And then they infer from that what their policy positions are. And those are actually kind of murky. Most voters don't know much about their views on specific policies. They have high-level values. And so it completely reversed the direction of causation. I was wrong, North was right. That we should start at the level of ideology. Ideology is really the foundational principle. And ideologies are mediated by institutions. So if you want to understand society, you have to look at institutions and ideologies. If you want to explain social change, you need to ask a question that I think is way too little asked, much less answered. What is persuasion? People change their mind. The economists model how they, think about how does an economist model if somebody changes their mind? So I'm looking at two cars. I'm going to buy this one. No, I'm going to change my mind and buy this one. Well, I found out something about price. I found out something about quality. I've fixed underlying preferences. That's not the way that ideologies work. Sometimes people like North himself changed his mind. He was a Marxist and then he became a neoclassical economist. The set of ideas that he thought were correct actually changed. So we understand almost nothing about persuasion. And so persuasion is that North would always say this frustrating thing. People almost never change their minds until they do.
That's a great quote. That's a great quote. All right, just to challenge that a little bit, because I think in the past people were more principled, let's say that. They might have been more religious. We can certainly see that in the statistics. They might belong to more parties and so on. Nowadays, people are less principled. So what would that say about the ideology? Because they might not have that many principles to sort of make these heuristic decisions, if you get what I mean, right? Especially in modern democracies.
The two things.
Yeah.
One, it means that the sort of coherence of their view is less. There might just be contradictions.
Exactly, yeah.
The second is that they're probably more susceptible to demagogues. So a demagogue who says, your problem is the Muslims, Jews,
whatever, insert group X, yeah.
So I think many people in Europe are surprised at the extent to which right-wing parties who have just done this, demagogues who say it's somebody else's fault, we need to rise up and reestablish our purity as a people.
Yeah.
That just seemed impossible 20 years ago. That was not the way Europe worked. Well, it's the way human minds work when they don't have a strong set of underlying principles. And so the basic disappearance of organized religion in Northern Europe especially means that the people are susceptible to demagogues to replace that with some other ready-made ideology. And we are meme accepting machines. If you tell me a set of ideas that explain something that I care about, and I don't already have some principles, then I am susceptible to demagogues. And so I think that's the decline of organized ideologies seems like a good thing, but it's a terrible thing because it's going to be replaced by demagoguery.
And it might actually be worse.
Much worse.
Because, for instance, if not to speak too much about Denmark, but we have a big welfare state, and most people cannot imagine what a non-welfare state society would be. So the welfare state recreates itself as some sort of ideal, when in reality it might just be a rent-seeking scheme, right? So you get these people who are upholding a system that is getting gradually worse, potentially, because they're not principled, right? That's really interesting. Oh, that's the thing about that. So let me just get my notes here. Yeah, let's start with this one. Jumping to another topic here. How should economics be taught?
Another of my favorite people, also a laureate, was James Buchanan.
Yeah. And
Buchanan thought of economics as being a social and institutional activity. So Eugen von Bauwerk famously said the way that we should judge an economics textbook is how many pages before you talk about a trade in which the price is indeterminate. Because in economics, we try to, as fast as we can, we get to the point with the determinate price at the intersection of supply and demand.
Yeah.
The whole point of economics ought to be that price is indeterminate.
Yeah.
And so von Bauwerk, I think on the second page, said there's a guy who has a horse and there's a guy who wants a horse. What happens? And the fact is the two of them negotiate and they bargain, and it's not clear what happens.
Oh.
So much of economics doesn't reflect what I think is a basic underlying truth. And so I've actually thought about the answer to your question. I'm working with some people on some new economic curriculums. I don't know if anybody will ever use it. Every agreement on price reflects a disagreement on values.
Good point. Yeah.
It has to.
Yeah, it has to.
So
yeah, good point.
We focus on the agreement on price, but it underlying that has to be a disagreement on value. The buyer must think it's worth more, and the seller must think it's worth less.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the exchange wouldn't happen. And so that's what motivates this. But that means that already you're in a social position. It always takes at least two people who disagree to make markets work.
Of course.
Now, they agree on a price, but that's the part that's mutually beneficial.
Yeah.
So if you just look at optimization as if it were Robinson Crusoe on his island, obviously he can optimize the allocation of his time among competing uses. That's not economics.
Okay.
Economics is social and relies on institutions.
I really like that point. I always make it a point when I teach undergrads that a supply and demand graph is a relationship. That's what it shows. It's a relationship. So there's some people here, because then you can also talk about consumer sovereignty, of course, and all these other things. But if you just focus on like, where do the lines meet, you're missing out on that whole.
It's physics, though.
It's physics, then, right? It's physics, yeah. So you already touched a little bit about this, but maybe as a roundup question, what is the relevance to modern economists of knowing the history of thought of the field? Is there any?
I think that's a very difficult question, and history of thought is disappearing, at least in the United States.
Yeah.
So one of the places that still has a pretty big history of thought group is Duke, where I teach. So I feel fortunate to be there. But Duke's economics department has largely sort of created a separate, I hesitate to say ghetto, a separate place, a basement, where the history of political economy group.
It is quite literally a basement, as far as I remember. Yes, yeah, I've been there.
And it is one of the best in the U.S. because it's one of the only ones in the U.S. And so you can understand it. If I'm a physicist, I don't read Plato or Aristotle to learn about their physics because it was terrible.
Oh, yeah.
And so the question of where do these ideas that we care about, where do they come from? I think a lot of economists don't care very much because they're more interested in the technical side.
Yeah.
So I think there are two elements to this. You would probably not read Alfred Marshall to learn supply and demand. The way he did it was cumbersome. There's problems. You would look at the way that Samuelson generated it in the foundations, or look at some more modern treatment of supply and demand. So for that, you don't need to. But if you read Alfred Marshall on the problem of resource allocation or economic growth or justice, there's a lot of ideas there that have not been fully exploited.
Yeah.
And so I think the history of thought needs to be combined with my claim that economic is a social activity. We actually know a lot about the physics and engineering part of economics, is writing it out as general equilibrium theory, and that's useful. I don't want to diminish that.
No.
But let us continue to try to make progress on the social problem and the idea of institutions and impersonal markets that connect to a political economy. So another of North's questions that I always thought was very frustrating but is important is, what are the preconditions for a market even to exist? Markets are not what happens when there's no government. Mm-hmm. It actually requires something. So there is probably a visible hand that's operating invisibly behind the invisible hand. And the economists just take it for granted that there's property rights, there's a means of adjudicating disputes, there's a currency, there's a financial system where I can make liquid the value of these large assets. Without those things, capitalism doesn't work very well. But it's not capitalism's fault. It's not a market failure if those things don't exist. It's a government failure.
Yeah.
And so I have written a fair amount. I wrote an article called The Anatomy of Government Failure that was published in Public Choice, and it's obviously echoing Francis Bator's The Anatomy of Market Failure from the early 50s. So many people define government failure as being when the government fails to correct market failures. That's not right. Government is quite capable of failing on its own in establishing the preconditions that markets require. It's not a failure of markets if there are no property rights.
No, that's true. Yeah.
So I think we need to, the future of history of economic thought is to look at these great theorists of the past and develop a more and more rich theory of government failure to provide a political economy in which markets can work effectively.
I think this is so interesting. I'm very, I have this little pet peeve where I'm very interested in markets in the Stone Age, because we see that people trade it. And it's an insane thing to think about, that people will journey like 100 miles on foot through what they experienced to be a spiritual world that was trying to kill them in every physical and spiritual way you can imagine. And they still did that. So that speaks that markets are somehow natural. But I think you're right that there's also probably a lot we don't know. They probably had some kind of system for monetary exchange. They probably had some institution for how to trade with strangers. We just don't know. They're lost, right? There's no written sources. Yeah. We'll never know. We can see in this evidence that they traded, but we don't actually know the governance around that. And I think that's a really interesting point. So last question before we round out. I think this has been an amazing talk. I'm sure the listeners will love this. If you were giving a really hard choice, sometimes economics is about scarcity too, right? You have an undergrad class. Should they be taught basic micro, or should they be taught the history of thought of economics?
Is this the only class they're going to take in economics?
Yeah, let's say that.
History of thought.
History of thought. Yeah. Why?
Memorizing a few things about it's been shown that 6 months after taking a basic micro class, very few people can say anything sensible about what they learned. Yeah. What they memorized was a set of graphs. Yeah. So I think in order to learn microeconomics, you have to do it using calculus and derive it. Yeah. If you just take the usual basic microeconomics class is largely a waste of time. And in fact, some people have asked, why is it that we do all this stuff with indifference curves and demand curves? And the answer of a number of economists is, well, it's good for teaching.
That's a great way to end it. Thank you so much for your time, Mike.
It was a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for spending your valuable time with us exploring the history of economic thought. You're very welcome to email comments and suggestions to stefan@cepos.dk. Please like and share and recommend this podcast anywhere you can and think it's relevant. Until next time, stay rational.